who's a friend are from Middle Eastern countries who are not, and if we want to create 20,000 American jobs. So that's what's at stake between now and February 21st. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge, first of all, the President to side with America in those creation of 20,000 jobs, but to approve the Keystone Pipeline. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to the Chair.
If the gentleman would yield, I'd love to go back to something that he mentioned.
And if the Chair will allow it, I'll be happy to yield to the gentlelady from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to something that Mr. Scalise said, which I think gets to the heart of the issue that we're talking about. And I would like to highlight this with our colleagues. Mr. Scalise, who knows this issue so very well because he is from Louisiana, he has constituents who work in this industry every day. And he said what the President had done was to choose to make a conscious decision to push off making a definitive pronouncement on the Keystone Pipeline. And, Mr. Chairman, I think that is so important. And what Mr. Scalise is saying gets to the heart of this. The President made that decision. Usually, and Mr. Scalise can illuminate us on this issue a bit, but it is my understanding that generally a presidential permit requires anywhere from 18 to 24 months to secure, and that currently the Keystone Pipeline is in its 40th month of trying to get a permit from this administration, from the President, and that if the President has his way on this, he is going to push that, and it would be another 12 months. And I would yield back to the gentleman.
Well, the gentlelady from Tennessee is correct. In fact, when you look at the timeline for Keystone, as you said, it's been 40 months. And the thing is here that the State Department has done the review. You know, the President right now is trying to give some indications that now February 21st might not be enough time for him, when in fact he's had much longer than the normal process for any review. But he's also got the approval from the State Department. And I'll yield in one moment because there's one other big factor here. There's also the fact that China is out there saying they want the oil. So as America, through President Obama saying that he doesn't want to do it or he wants to delay it until after the election, where Canada's indicated they can't wait until after the election in November, they've got to make a decision. And they want to send the oil to the United States of America because we're great trading partners. But if the President Obama, keeps saying no, China right now is saying they want the oil. So we don't have an unlimited amount of time for the President to keep kowtowing to his radical environmentalist friends and try to kick the can down the road. A decision needs to be made, and February 21st is that date that's currently available, and we're trying to push the President to make that decision in the affirmative way and say yes to those 20,000 jobs that would be created here. And with that, I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman.
So the gentleman's point, I think, is so important to make. The President has already taken twice as long as most presidents would take to enter into this decision. So he's already had twice as much time, but he's asking for half again as much time to make this decision. And while he can't make a decision, it's like voting present when you come to the floor to cast a vote. Not being able to make a decision, being indecisive on this. While that is transpiring, the United States is looking at 20,000 direct American jobs and an additional 118,000 private sector jobs that would be linked to this project if my information is correct that I have received. So you're talking about a total of 138,000 direct and indirect American jobs, good paying jobs, that are American products that will produce energy that is right here that we would be getting from Canada and bringing in about 700,000 barrels of oil a day, so that we could begin to break the ties that are existing with OPEC and Middle Eastern oil. And I think that it's so important for us to look at this. This is not an issue of taking more time or additional time. The time is now. because we've already spent twice as much time as is generally needed to do the due diligence and to check the process and to make that decision that will move us toward energy independence. And I yield back to the gentleman from Louisiana.
Well, thank the gentlelady from Tennessee. I think it's been clear what's been laid out, the decision that should be made by President Obama. Unfortunately, he continues to drag his feet, try to punt on this issue, but ultimately a decision's going to have to be made if we're going to be able to get those 20,000 jobs here in America, or whether or not they're going to go to China, who's also asking for them. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time to Mr. Chairman.
Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011. The gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, is recognized for the remainder of the hour. Gentlewoman from Tennessee? Then under the Speaker's announced policy for January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Harper, is recognized for the remainder of the hour.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the President has spent a lot of time during the last 3 months traveling around the country, these many months, demanding that Congress put aside party differences and pass the bill, referring to his $447 billion so-called jobs bill. But if the President were to get off the campaign trail and focus on the facts, he would realize that House Republicans have been advancing a pro-growth agenda that creates jobs without expanding the federal government's role. You know, the House of Representatives has voted numerous times this year, in the 112th Congress, to increase American oil production, which would put Americans back to work, reduce our country's dependence upon foreign oil, and lower prices at the pump. And I ask you to think back to when the President took office. The average price for a gallon of gas in this country was $1.83. We can only barely remember such a time. These are steps that we can take that can turn that around. Those bills that we did pass out of the House would speed up the permitting process for drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, require the Secretary of the Interior to conduct more offshore oil and gas leases, direct the Department of Interior to proceed with exploration and production in the areas estimated to contain the most oil and gas, and eliminate this administration's bureaucratic delays that have stalled offshore energy production in the outer continental shelf. Further, the House has voted multiple times to push for a final decision on the Keystone XL pipeline. The Keystone XL pipeline application was filed more than 3 years ago, and a final decision on whether to let the pipeline go forward is long, long overdue. In his first term in office, the President has talked about the need for energy independence. Keystone XL could help provide the United States with the certainty of almost 1 million barrels of oil a day. And that oil comes from our friends and largest trading partner, Canada, not the Middle East. At a time when the President has tasked 3 aircraft carrier strike groups with protecting the Strait of Hormuz, wouldn't approving this new source of friendly oil be just good, plain common sense? The President has struggled with turning the economy around since taking office 3 years ago, and his speeches often center on the subject of jobs. If approved today, the Keystone XL project would create 20,000 construction jobs and an estimated 100,000 indirect jobs during the life of its operation for Americans who desperately need them. Look at these 20,000 jobs that are there that are held up. You know, I think back to my late father. His first job as a petroleum engineer was in Tinsley Field in Yazoo County, Mississippi. Those jobs matter to families. It's time to move forward and approve this. Instead of issuing the necessary permits to begin construction of the pipeline and putting American families and Americans to work, the administration is in the 3rd year, almost 4 years now, of dragging its feet through bureaucratic delays and indecision. It can only be for political reasons. Pro-business groups like Americans for Prosperity and the Chamber of Commerce are supporting Keystone XL to give a much-needed boost to the economy. Even pro-labor groups are supporting Keystone XL because they know it will create jobs. Americans across the country are asking this president to approve this project. They realize its importance, and they deserve to be answered. The Keystone XL pipeline is just one example of how House Republicans have been working to promote job creation without the need for stimulus money. Today, it is the most pressing. Every day that the president kicks the can down the road is another day without the jobs, and another day without the relief from Middle Eastern oil, and another day that Americans should be asking this administration, this White House, where are the jobs? With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, is recognized for the remainder of the hour.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to address the House on the issue of the Keystone XL pipeline. There are pipe dreams and pipelines out there that people talk about. Apparently, when it comes to jobs, maybe the pipeline is apparently a pipe dream. We have an opportunity in this country to secure our energy future with North American energy, to create American jobs on a project that is a 1,700-mile-long pipeline. You know, I hear all the time from constituents in Colorado about, hey, what's the deal with this pipeline? Why can't we get forward moving, creating jobs, American energy independence, using North America's great resources to help our country create jobs in a more secure energy future? And the conversation then really revolves around common sense ideas. Here's a president who, the president has said in the past that we need to support shovel-ready projects, that the stimulus bill that passed in 2009 was all about shovel-ready projects. And if you go back to last summer, I believe the president had said, well, I guess that shovel-ready wasn't as shovel-ready as we thought it was. Well, here's a shovel-ready project. Here is a pipeline, a private-funded pipeline that's ready to be built. 1,700 miles, 20,000 American jobs. We could get started on that today. It's been years since this pipeline was actually the permit process first started. And yet here we are waiting once again. This isn't a surprise to anybody. Shouldn't shock anybody that the issue of the pipeline came up. The bill that we passed in December said you got to make a decision. The president has said he would make a decision. And yet we still have no decision. And I find it difficult to understand what is really the tough part of this decision. We can create jobs right now with a truly shovel-ready project. Earlier this year, back in February of last year, we had testimony before the Energy and Commerce Committee that talked about the development of the Alberta oil sands and what it would mean to jobs in the United States. Now, the Keystone Pipeline is part of that. According to the testimony we received at committee, between 2011 and 2015, 6,000 jobs could be created in Colorado alone because of the development of the Alberta oil sands. The 4th Congressional District of Colorado that I represent has 2 counties. When you look at the true unemployment rates, the unemployment rates that takes into account people who have just given up work, who've given up looking for work, who've just decided that they can't find work so they've stopped looking. 2 counties in my district have over 19% unemployment when you look at it through the lens of people who have stopped looking for work. A project like the Keystone Pipeline, 20,000 direct jobs, 100,000 jobs indirectly created. Development of the Alberta oil sands, creating 6,000 jobs in Colorado over the next 3 years, next 4 years. These are good-paying American jobs with North American energy that we could be putting to the benefit of this country. We know there are willing partners out there. We know there are other people who've said, go ahead, we'll take the business. We'll partner with you. We're not afraid. China has more than once said that this is something that they would look at. Canada has made it very clear that they won't just stop if we say no. Shovel-ready projects. Here it is, our opportunity to create American jobs. 3 years ago, the application was filed to build the pipeline. Most Americans at town meetings that I attend, they all know about this pipeline. They know where it's going. They know what's happening with it. It's been our goal in this 112th Congress to look out for the economy, to advance projects that make sense when it comes to American energy and North American energy and American job creation. That ought to be the goal of every single one of us in this Congress. Every action we take should be looked at the same lens that we look at the Keystone Pipeline, creating jobs. I'm continuously awed at the energy resources that we have in North America and how simple it would be to advance policies that would make us more energy independent, and yet we still can't move forward because no decision has been made. Baffled at how difficult this administration has made it when it comes to weaning ourselves off of overseas oil, at the same time creating more jobs right here at home. The administration has done everything it can to stand in the way of a project that can help Americans get back to work. A $7 billion private sector infrastructure project. When construction jobs around Colorado, around this country, have been some of the hardest hit by the recession, this project provides a lifeline to thousands of construction workers seeking ways to get back on their feet. But the inaction of this administration has led us down a path of insecurity and dependence on other countries that have great animosity toward us. It's simply unacceptable. Not only do we have the resources in our own backyard in North America, but we have the ability to utilize friendly and willing neighbors like Canada to import that oil. Mr. Speaker, our unemployment rate as a nation has hovered around 9% for far too long. There's no reason that the federal government should not be supporting a private sector solution done with private capital at a time like this. With rising gas prices, the threat of the Strait of Hormuz being blocked, and unemployment hovering so high, we simply cannot afford not to act. Mr. Speaker, the President has had plenty of time to make a decision. The studies have been submitted. The conversations have taken place. The debate has occurred. But what's winning this debate is the fact that the American people understand how many jobs would be created with the North American Energy Project. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time, and thank you for the opportunity tonight.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, is recognized for the remainder of the hour.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 36 days, the President will have an opportunity to do a great thing for America. He'll have an opportunity to allow private industry with private funds to build a pipeline to carry petroleum all across the country, to lower the price for consumers driving their cars, for manufacturers who use these products, and to do so in a way that is environmentally friendly. It is indeed my hope that the President will take this opportunity to do just that. Today we've got oil at over $100 a barrel. It was not all that long ago in the history of our country that we stared at North American energy production and wondered, will we have enough natural gas? Will we have enough oil here domestically so that we don't have to depend on the Middle East? I remember when I was much younger, sitting in car lines waiting, lines of cars waiting to get gasoline. We could only get gas on even days because that was the license plate that we had on our car. Today, technology and innovation, American style, has led us to a place where we've got an abundance of energy. All we're asking is that we permit a pipeline to carry that product safely all across the country so we can get that energy to the places we need it at prices that Americans can afford. We know, too, that we suffer much like we did back in the late 1970s. At the same time, we had this perceived shortage of fossil fuels. We also had enormously high unemployment. We had a misery index in the low 20s. Today we have a similar phenomenon. We've got far too many people out of work. Unemployment officially at 8.5%, but if you go around Kansas' 4th Congressional District, you know that it's much higher in the place that matters, the place of folks who would really rather work more hours, would rather work for higher pay, or frankly, we've got a lot of folks who've just found the workplace so unappealing to them in terms of their job prospects that they've given up. And yet here we sit with a project that everyone agrees will create 20,000 jobs. Most of those jobs are with trade unions, folks that are building and welding and riveting, and who will make this pipeline safe and secure. And yet we've got a President who continues to reject this as an option for our country. we need this capacity. We have found oil in North Dakota. We are finding oil in south central Kansas. We've got to make sure that this product can get to the markets, the places that it needs to be. This pipeline would do that. Now, I can't figure out for the life of me why this pipeline has become the cause célèbre of the left. We have tens of thousands of miles of pipelines all across this country. This product is transported safely. It is highly regulated. Indeed, this year, in a year when there were lots of bickering between the parties, we passed a piece of pipeline legislation, pipeline safety legislation, which will continue to further improve the way we transport fossil fuels around our country. This pipeline can be done safely, too. The objection that there's risk to groundwater and to environmental harm is greatly overblown. Industrial accidents certainly happen, but we know to make America move forward, we've got to do it in a way that is responsible, safe, and everything about the way this pipeline has been engineered and developed meets that mark. This president has shared this notion of energy independence. As we all do, we see the need for it. And yet he's taken an approach that is so different from what we are trying to do with the Keystone XL pipeline. This approach has private citizens meeting real demand in the real marketplace, folks who want products. The president's approach has been very different. He has spent hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money trying to subsidize energy sources that America does not want. It's not that America wouldn't like solar energy or wind energy. It's simply that today they can't be provided at a cost-effective manner. And so we force taxpayers to subsidize those energies to try and bring them to market. We've seen what happens when you do that. You get things that happen like Solyndra. We don't need to do that. The energy is available. The risk will be taken by private industry. They'll provide the capital. They'll provide the hard work. They'll provide the innovation. They'll provide energy for America at a time we so desperately need it. I just returned to Washington, D.C. today. I was in the airport in Wichita, Kansas. I talked with half a dozen folks. Each of them talked about jobs being the most pressing issue that they wanted me to take care of when I came back to Washington, D.C. I spent a lot of time over the break as well talking with folks who provide energy. We have lots of independent drillers and E&P companies and folks who provide field services to the oil patch in Kansas and in Oklahoma and Nebraska, all around. We need these products. The consumers need these products. And I hope that the President, 36 days from now, will decide that he agrees. Affordable American energy coming from North America, provided safely, so that the Keystone XL pipeline can move forward. With that, I yield back the balance of my time to the Chairman.
Thank you. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lankford, is recognized for the remainder of the hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell you, living in Oklahoma City, and if you come through Oklahoma at all, you'll drive around and you'll see our beautiful land. You'll drink our beautiful water and breathe our beautiful air. But you'll also realize that there are thousands of miles of pipeline underneath your feet. Because you see, Oklahoma is the center of pipeline movement through a lot of the United States. In fact, just north and east of my house in Oklahoma City is a little small town called Cushing, Oklahoma. And if you know anything about pipeline and about oil, you know about Cushing, Oklahoma. Because it's a large storage facility there for a lot of petroleum products, and it is the hub for everything that moves as far as oil and all pipelines running through the Midwest. Cushing, Oklahoma is part of that connection for the Keystone Pipeline. And when you talk to people in Oklahoma about pipelines, we're very familiar with what they are, how they move energy, and how important that they are to our economy. Let me just touch base on a couple of things, though. While we're talking about Keystone, it's interesting to me in several ways. One is I'm 43 years old, and for my entire life, I've heard people say in politics, we need to have a national energy policy. We need to be dependent on energy from our soil or from our nearest neighbors, Canada and Mexico. We need to have a North American focus of energy. And I would have to say I completely agree. But we've never had a time in our life where we're closer to that than right now. The rising alternative fuel options, whether it be solar and wind, and I hope all of them come to be, we're still decades away from them being able to be fully established and out there. We're very dependent still on oil, gas, and coal. But we're finding new reserves in North America of oil, gas, and coal that are solving a lot of the energy issues that we currently have right now. Many people don't know that in the last quarter of 2011, 58% of the oil consumed in the United States was found domestically in the United States. 58%. If you go back just 20 years ago, 60% of our oil was coming overseas. Now almost 60% of our oil is now in the United States, coming from the United States. We are making progress. Hydraulic fracking, horizontal drilling, finding new well sites, great new technology in geology, all the ways that we're finding these new sources of energy, doing it cleaner, doing it less expensive than we've ever done it before. That's a good thing for us. We are now close to providing our own energy sources. The second largest reserve of oil in the world is now from this area where the Keystone Pipeline originates in Canada. Second largest oil reserve in the world. This is a key time for us now getting better technology in the United States to be able to use our own energy to now partner up with Canada and continue to draw in even more energy from Canada from this huge reserve that is there. We need to continue to draw from them in that sense. Now, you would think this would be a simple thing. Focus on our own national security. Why wouldn't we continue to focus in and say, if we're this close to being energy independent, where we are not dependent on energy from the Middle East, why wouldn't we continue to take the steps on this? In addition to that, why wouldn't we continue to expand on our pipelines? You see, this is not the first time for Keystone to do a pipeline coming from Canada to the United States. They did one just a very few years ago. In fact, that Keystone that they did a few years ago took 24 months to permit. From the exact same area to the same area. 24 months for the total permitting process. That pipeline is functional and active and running right now. They want to double up the capacity. So you would think this would be a slam dunk. Let's just add a second line there. They run through the permit process through the same system, but instead of 24 months this time, we're now at 42 months of permitting and still climbing. Where this same pipeline crossing over the border, drawing oil from the exact same area, took 24 months a few years ago. Now that pipeline takes 42 months and climbing. We're not sure how much longer it's going to take. In addition to that, Keystone is running there. That's one company. There's also another company, Enbridge, which draws oil from that exact same area in Canada, takes it through the United States. That pipeline is also currently running and hasn't had any issues with permitting and through the process of construction that it did years ago. You see, this is not some new oil discovery that's up there that we've never tapped into. The United States uses that oil and has used that oil for a long time. It is a reserve that is from a reliable neighbor next door in Canada that's consistent, that we're not having to deal with issues in the Strait of Hormuz and wondering about the flow of oil coming from the Middle East. We're dealing with the United States, now 58% of our oil usage coming from our own home country, and then we're dealing with reliable neighbors, dealing with our pipelines like Canada and Mexico. It's the right thing to do for our national security. It's the right thing to do for jobs. We're talking about immediately private jobs. No government participation in it other than the permitting being finished. Private money begins to sink in the billions of dollars to be able to run almost 1,700 miles of pipeline. You're talking pipe fitters, which are based often in Oklahoma, by the way, union jobs, right-to-work areas and other job areas. You're dealing with steel manufacturers for that pipe. Pipe manufactured, most of it done in Arkansas. People digging the ditches, running the tractors, driving the trucks, all of the different areas that are attached to that. Thousands of jobs that begin immediately across the entire central part of the United States and many manufacturing areas. We need to be able to open that up and let those jobs run, and let's get those going on that. And then the third thing on this, not only national security and jobs, but just basic common sense. That oil will be sold somewhere. It's not a matter of we can argue and complain about it, and so Canada's not going to use their own resources. When the second largest discovery of oil in the world is underneath your feet, they're going to sell that oil. So just shutting it down and saying Americans aren't going to take it, we're going to let them sell it off, and they'll send it west over into Asia, and that'll make things a lot better, doesn't make common sense, number one. Number two is we should provide as much national security as we can from this. That's basic common sense with reliable neighbors. Number three in the common sense is this basic simple thing. It's new pipeline. Now, we can argue about pipeline safety, and there are areas we need to work on pipeline safety, and we in this Congress, as Republicans and Democrats together, have passed pipeline safety initiatives, and we should do that. This will be the newest pipeline in the country. It'll have the highest standards for safety. It'll have the highest level of technology and of monitoring of any pipeline in the country. It is the best possible way to do it. The alternative is to be able to put it on trucks and trains, which have a higher incident for accidents. This is the safest way to be able to do this. And as I mentioned before, it's not as if we're not already drawing this oil already. This just increases our capacity and increases our ability to not be dependent on Venezuela and OPEC countries for our oil. There are pipelines from Enbridge and Keystone running from that exact same area all the way down to the Gulf already. We need to continue to increase our capacity so that we are providing for our own energy long term. I would submit to this Congress, and I would submit to the President and ask for his prompt approval, even early would be great, of approval of this, to be able to move forward and say, let's get this off our back, let's get the jobs going, let's continue to move forward with our national security, providing for our own energy, and let's continue to work through this process so that we don't have to deal with issues like this again. Far be it from us in the days to come that manufacturers would say, I don't want to do manufacturing and construction in the United States because I'm afraid the President will slow down a jobs project. I'm afraid Congress will slow down a jobs project. I'm afraid that that country is not open for business. We should do it better than the rest of the world. We can, and we do. This is a simple project. Approve the Keystone Pipeline. It's been approved through these states. Nebraska is working through its system of its approval process. We need to just approve that 50 feet crossing the border from Canada to the United States, and let's get this project going. With that, I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back, seeing no further requests for recognition. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta's time having expired, and under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader. Mr. Garamendi is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's good to be back, and wishing you and all of our colleagues the best of this new year and a happy new year. And I hope yours and the other 433 members of this august body had a great holiday season. For many Americans, that was not the case, however. Unemployment remains high, and fortunately, just before we broke for the Christmas holidays, we did pass a piece of legislation that extended the unemployment insurance, and that's really important, and also extended for 2 months the reduction in the payroll tax. And that put money into the pockets of working men and women around this nation. We have much work to do this year. We just heard a presentation on the Keystone Pipeline, which will add a few jobs, some 6,000 jobs, temporary, building the pipeline, and that's good. The rush to judgment on it, however, should be very cautiously approached. Pipelines can be dangerous. You only need to look in California where a gas pipeline exploded, and the recent Yellowstone contamination that was caused by a broken oil pipeline. Haste can make waste, and it can cause problems. So I would urge us to be circumspect. I suspect someday this pipeline will be built, but it ought to be built properly and in the right locations. But the subject of tonight's discourse is really about jobs. I'll be joined a little later by my friend Paul Tonko from the great state of New York, and perhaps Marcy Kaptur from Ohio will be here. What we want to talk about is jobs, not just temporary jobs building a pipeline, but rather solid American jobs in the manufacturing sector. For more than a year, we've been talking about making it in America, rebuilding the great American engine of wealth, the great American engine that created the biggest middle class anywhere in the world, and the great American engine that over the last 20 years has seen an incredible decline, often caused by policy, governmental policy, A couple of examples to give you. Outsourcing. Outsourcing doesn't just happen. It happens because the economics of the situation have changed. When I arrived here in November of 2009, a debate was underway about how to rebuild the American economy. And one of the things that we took up was the issue of taxes. Turns out that American corporations receive somewhere between $12 and $15 billion a year in tax reductions. That is, you and I, all of us, get to pay corporations for doing what? Sending jobs offshore, offshoring American jobs. Fortunately, in December of 2010, without any support at all from our Republican colleagues, we passed legislation that terminated $12 billion of those subsidies, providing a positive encouragement or eliminating a positive encouragement for corporations to offshore jobs. We can do more, and that's what the Make It in America agenda is all about. Many, many pieces in this. Economists that look at the American economy and where we are today will note that we've seen significant growth in jobs. The unemployment rate is down to 8.5%, and that's a good thing, but it's still far too high. We've seen some 330,000 manufacturing jobs created just this last year, and that's good, but that's not enough. On the other hand, we've also seen layoffs. The government sector, despite what you might hear, has actually seen a very significant decline in employment. State government, local governments all across this nation have been laying off people. In California, 42,000 teachers have lost their jobs in the last 2 years. An incredible statistic. At a time when we need a more highly educated workforce, to lay off teachers seems to be a real serious no-brainer. Why would we do that? Well, we did it. And we have layoffs like that occurring across this nation. We need to turn that around, and we can. We need to turn around the decline that occurred over the last 20 years in the manufacturing sector, and we've made a start, but there's much more to be done. We've lost perhaps 45% of all of our manufacturing jobs, from some 19 million to down to just over 11 million in the last 20 years. Coming back, 330,000 this year. More to be done. Fortunately, we have an ally in the White House. That ally is President Barack Obama, who, as he said just last week, wakes up every day thinking about how can we Americans solve this crisis in our economy. What can we do to put men and women back to work? How can families know that they have a secure future? Way back in September, President Obama proposed the American Jobs Act. It wasn't the first thing that was done to get Americans back to work, but it's a very, very important step. The first thing that was done by President Obama and the Democratic majority in this House way back in January of 2009, when the new administration took office, was to create the American Recovery Act. Some people call it the stimulus. No matter what else you hear, the stimulus works, and it's working today. In my district out in California, you can't go very far down a highway, cross a bridge, see a levee, see a new manufacturing facility in place without knowing or seeing a sign that says the American Recovery Act. Bridges are being built. Highways have been repaired. The Caldecott Tunnel on the East Bay and the Oakland Hills has now been drilled through the mountain. It'll be completed, almost totally financed by local government and a larger majority of the money from the American Recovery Act. We can rebuild jobs in America. That was step one. Along the way, we've seen tax policy changes. We've seen a tax policy that the President proposed and enacted by the Democrats with some Republican help in 2010 that actually gave companies a 100% write-off for every capital investment that they made. The result of that, some of the greatest capital investment in the last 20 years has been made just in 2011. We're putting people back to work. We've got a long way to go. We're not nearly where we need to be. And for employers, an incentive in the American Jobs Act that the President proposed last September has now become law. With both Democrat and Republican support, bipartisanship really does exist. And that proposal, now law, gives employers a tax reduction, a credit, for every returned veteran from America's wars. They can go all the way back to the Vietnam War. And an employer that takes a long-term unemployed veteran can get $2,500 reduction in their taxes for every veteran they keep on for a full year. For a disabled veteran, injured in the line of service, $9,600 reduction in the employer's taxes. A very, very powerful incentive to hire those veterans who have sacrificed so much for this nation, for the very safety and the freedom that we enjoy. That's one part of the American Jobs Act. A couple of other pieces of the American Jobs Act still have to be put in place. And the one that I like is called the Infrastructure Bank. We know that we're not flush with cash. We know the federal government has a serious deficit, and we know that we need to solve that. We also know that we're not going to solve it unless we actually put people back to work. And the Infrastructure Bank is a very good way to deal with two problems simultaneously. Putting people back to work, building infrastructure, perhaps pipelines, certainly those kinds of projects that have a cash flow. Sanitation systems, water systems, toll roads, toll bridges, all of those things where there's a cash flow where we pay a fee for using that particular piece of infrastructure. The Infrastructure Bank would be started with a loan from the federal government. The President recommended $10 billion. I say go the whole route. Let's put in $25 billion of federal money. Then reach out to the pension funds around the nation and give them an opportunity to invest in this. Right now, you want to buy a government bond, it's less than 2% return. An infrastructure bank could probably give you 5–6% return. So the pension funds would have a place to invest, both public and private pension funds. Most who have looked at this believe that you could generate anywhere from $70 to $100 billion of loan capability that could immediately be used to build projects. I know in my district that we have sanitation projects that need to be built. We have water projects, we have levees, we have dams, and we have other infrastructure that needs to be built. Those that are cash flow possible can use the Infrastructure Bank. In so doing, we free up those other infrastructure projects for which there is not a cash flow. For example, the levees that I just mentioned. And there are many other projects, highway projects, universities, laboratories, research facilities, that you could then use the general fund, as we have done for more than a century, to build these infrastructure projects. So the American Jobs Act, as proposed by the President, has an infrastructure bank in it. It also has a major infrastructure project tandem to it. So those two things together can put men and women to work across this nation. And even more can be done if this particular piece of legislation were to pass. This is the real Make It in America piece of legislation. I happen to be the author of it. I wasn't the first to think of it. For some time we've had what we call Buy America, but it's been routinely ignored over the years. So the Buy America provisions, while ignored, need to be strengthened, and that's what this piece of legislation does. What it does, it says that our tax money, gasoline tax 18.5 cents, diesel tax some 25 cents a gallon, goes into the transportation fund. Is that money being used to buy American buses and railroad and high-speed rail, the transit facilities? Is it? Often it is not. But if this bill passes, and it is now before the Transportation Committee here in the House, were it to pass, it would require that all of our tax money, spread out over a 5-year phase-in process, would be used to buy American-made equipment. You want to travel out to San Francisco? You ought to. We could use your tax dollars out there and come and visit. But as you travel from Oakland to San Francisco, you'll travel on the old Oakland-San Francisco Bay Bridge. Just adjacent to it is a new magnificent bridge being built. But it's not being built with American steel. And most of the welding was done not by Americans, but by Chinese. In an effort to save 10%, the state of California decided that they would buy Chinese products, Chinese steel. Thousands of jobs created in China, virtually none in America. Chinese engineers came to see that the steel was properly erected. Where were the American engineers? This piece of legislation has now been adopted by the state of California. It's the law there now. And I dare say that if this type of legislation were the law when the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge was put out to bid, that steel would have been made in America, American steel workers would be employed, American welders would have done the welding, and there would not have been the quality problems that were found in the Chinese product and their Chinese workmanship. Let's make it in America. Let's use our tax money to buy American-made equipment. We just had a long discussion about oil. And we're going to use oil for a long time. That discussion also talked about natural gas, which many people see as a transition away from a dependency on oil to a dependency on renewable and green energy systems of the future. So we're probably going to be in a transition period for several years. But in order to get to that place where we are totally independent of the oil dictators around the world, where we are no longer using oil for transport, but rather using electricity or natural gas, we're going to need a transition. We're going to need assistance to move to that. For many years now, starting way back in the 1970s, the United States has had a policy of implementing what are known as green energy systems, principally solar, and I think all of us are familiar with solar, and similarly the wind turbines that are now being found on hilltops across this nation. So, where are those things made? Where do we make those? Where do those solar cells come from? Where are the wind turbines manufactured? Until very, very recently, not in America. But your tax money and my tax money is used to subsidize this new industry. And as that money is being spent, it must be spent on American-made equipment so that Americans can have those jobs. We're going to continue to import. If you want to go buy a solar system for your house, you can buy whatever you want. But if this bill passes, if you want that tax subsidy, then it's going to have to be an American-made solar system. No more outsourcing American dollars to China or Europe or wherever. Bring those dollars home. Put Americans back to work at home. These are things that can be done. It is a policy direction. And this Congress and the Senate should be moving quickly to make sure that things are made once again in America, particularly those things that use our tax dollars, whether it's a bus, a rail line, a bridge, or a solar cell, or a wind turbine. All of this is possible. All we need is a law that says our tax money will be used to buy American-made equipment. That is just one part of what we call Make It in America. This initiative has many other pieces. Some of it deals with education. We know, anybody that looks at any economy around the world knows that if you're going to have a strong economy, you have to have a very well-educated workforce. So where are we in America? Are we the best educated workforce in the world? We used to be, but not today. Not today. Earlier I mentioned 42,000 teachers laid off in California. President Obama had a solution to that. In the American Jobs Act, introduced last September, President Obama said, let's hire teachers. Some 280,000 teachers could have been hired across this nation for the fall semester if our Republican colleagues had brought that bill to the floor and we had found the sufficient votes here and in the Senate. That's not a bad thing to put 280,000 teachers back to work. And by the way, what are this kind of a facility will they be working in? If you were to look across our nation at the schools, you'll see many that are run down, old. The laboratories either in disuse or very ancient equipment, not up to date, even in Kansas City. So what are we going to do about this? The President said, let's invest in refurbishing our schools, putting men and women back to work, painting, fixing up the school grounds, repairing the toilets, building the new laboratories that are necessary for today's educational system. Hasn't happened yet. I would ask our Republican colleagues, if they care so mightily about the economy, they ought to care about the most fundamental investment that any society can make in its economy, and that is education. The American Jobs Act, many pieces to it: infrastructure, transportation, infrastructure bank, tax credits for hiring the unemployed, and a tax reduction for every American working through the payroll tax reduction. A good program. We're now in the middle of January. By the end of February, Congress will have to face the reality of terminating the unemployment or the payroll tax reduction and raising taxes on every American, or continuing it. For me, we ought to continue it. And we also ought to continue the unemployment benefits, because the jobs are not yet there. Had we passed the American Jobs Act, there'd be far more jobs available. That has not yet happened. And so we will face some very tough sledding ahead as we debate how shall we pay for this. How shall we pay for the February 29th extension of the payroll tax reduction and the unemployment insurance? Our Republican friends have basically said we ought to pay for it by taxing the middle class, by reducing those programs that the middle class depends upon, from health care to jobs to education. The Democrats have a different plan. We think President Obama is correct that we ought to ask those that have been so extraordinarily successful in the last 2 decades, the super rich in America, the top 1%, to pay their fair share in keeping Americans in their jobs and providing them with enough food that they can eat and pay their rent through the unemployment insurance. Let me just show you a chart here. Of why those super wealthy, those whose annual income is over $1 million a year, why they can pay just a little bit more. The bottom 4 lines, the bottom 3 lines here are the bottom 3/4 of the population. Those in poverty, low, middle, and middle class. The top line are those in the very top, the top 10%. They've seen their wealth grow by extraordinary numbers, some 350% increase in theirs, while down here at the bottom, very, very little. In fact, most of this comes from the husband and wife both working, 2 members of the family working. There's plenty of opportunity here. The President has suggested a very small tax increase of 3.5% on that amount over $1 million. It's not going to bust anybody's bank. They're still going to have plenty of money to go to the golfing and buy whatever they need to buy. But what will happen is Americans will continue to have an unemployment check if that job's not available to them, and Americans will also be able to see a reduction in their payroll tax so that they too can participate in this American economy. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up for the evening. And we want to keep in mind that America can make it when we make it in America. Federal policy is critical if we're going to succeed. There are many things that we can do. We've reviewed some of them here tonight, and we'll be talking more about it as this week and next week goes on, and we approach that February 29th, a once every 3-year opportunity for this nation to do what's right for those men and women and working families out there, and for those who are unemployed. Mr. Speaker, with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
You're gonna Martha's here. She's too loud. She's my replacement. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
To move that we adjourn.
The question on the motion to adjourn. The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
The House returned today from its holiday break to officially begin the second session of the 112th Congress and elect a new Sergeant-at-Arms, Paul Irving. Tomorrow, the House will vote on President Obama's request to raise the debt limit by $1.2 trillion.